Hi there everyone, it's Rosie. I'm here today to give you the first lesson of the history of the English language. We're going to have an introductory lesson and a general overview of the history of language. You can see that the lesson is divided into 4 parts. The first part is going to be a general introduction to the history of language. What do we mean by the history of language? And then we're going to talk about the history of spoken language, or the history of Indo-European languages, and we're also going to talk about the history of written language, so where our alphabet comes from exactly. Overall, the main idea of today's lesson is to give you some background on European linguistic history, and then later on we're going to narrow our focus onto just the history of the English language. Okay, so the first question I said we're going to discuss, it is, what do we mean by language change? And so to demonstrate that, I actually have 2 examples of text on the screen. The first one, it is the Russian language from 1,000 years ago, and the second one is the English language from 1,000 years ago. So let's compare the 2 pieces of language. Let's have a look at the Russian first. Exactly how much of this Russian can you, as a native Russian speaker, I hope, how much of this can you understand? There are a number of words which I can read, for example, jest and poshla and zemlya and Kiev. So this Russian language, more or less, you as a modern Russian speaker, you can understand it and even read it. Whereas on the other hand, we can look at an example of English from 1,000 years ago. Any words here that you can understand? Probably not, right? Even if I read it for you, Hlatvegarde na intandaton de königa frun se frunon huda ethelinga eller fremedon of chilchefing sheden athretum menegum medum milzetla of the Yorkso de Ola Shidan Erestvar, and so on. How many words can you understand? None, more or less. So what's happened to the English language? Has English just, do we just speak a totally different language today? Actually, no. There are a few words that you would be able to read if you were a native speaker. For example, shield is shield, König is king. Actually, the English we speak today does come from this Old English, as we call it on the screen. So this, it's evidence of language change. If we travel back in time 1,000 years, you would not be able to understand Old English. If we traveled back 1,000 years, you might be able to understand Old Slavic. Well, in any case, in the history of the English language, I want us to study how do we get from Old English to contemporary English, and why has English changed so much when other languages have changed so little. An example of a language that has almost not changed at all in the last 1,000 years is Icelandic. So there was a linguist, I've forgotten his name, I'll put it on the bottom of the screen. He decided that he was going to take the core 1,000 words from a language and then compare 1,000 years before and see how many of these core 1,000 words had changed. And not surprisingly, English is one of the ones that has changed the most in the last 1,000 years, by something like 20%, whereas something like Icelandic has changed so little, by something like just 5%. And so what has caused these changes, that's another thing that we can study in the history of the English language, some political, historical, cultural differences between different countries. So why are we studying the history of the English language? Well, by looking at the development of language, we can actually start to understand some of the weird things about the English language. For example, we have 2 different categories of verbs in English. As we know, we have regular verb, play, played, work, worked. And then we also have irregular verbs, run, ran, begin, began. Why is English doing this? Well, actually, the reason you can find in the history of language. Why do we say one man two men? One sheep, two sheep? Once again, the answer can be found by studying historical linguistics. If you're not particularly interested in linguistics, then studying the history of England can also help you to understand the culture of English people. If you'd like to study a language, I imagine that what's interesting for you about the language is not only communicating for business reasons, but also because you find the culture of the language interesting, I hope. So this course is not only for the linguists among you, it's also for you fans of culture who would like to learn a bit more about British history and American history and so on. If those two things are not for you, we're also going to study some literature in this course. We're going to study Beowulf, we're going to study Chaucer, and we're also going to study Shakespeare. These are three very influential writers and pieces of writing which have influenced the English language quite a lot. So we're going to look at those as well. So literature fans, you can enjoy those.